Hey, I'm Charlie. I produce drum and bass music under the alias Prspktv. Back in 2020, I released my first ever body of music with GoldFat Records. It was a two-tracker single, the A-side being Stargazing with an incredible MC that goes by the name of RSWT, and Love Drops on the B-side. A few weeks ago, I put a post up on Instagram asking which of those two tracks you would like to see a track breakdown of. Stargazing won, not by much, but it did have the majority of the votes, so here we are. So this is the project for Stargazing. My intention with these videos, with this track breakdown, is not to do one hugely long video, but I'm going to split it into different sections, or different parts. So in part one, in this video, we're going to cover the drums and the processing on the drums, and in the next video, it could be about maybe the effects and some of the instrumentation. There will be an in-depth part on how to process an MC's vocal. I've actually had quite a few messages asking to go over that, so we will be doing that at some point. But in this video, I just want to focus on the drums, otherwise we're going to be here for, I don't know, hours probably. I waffle quite a lot, so I'm going to try and keep it focused, try and keep it structured. And yeah, so let's go. Let's just give it a quick listen. And if you haven't heard it yet, you can cop it via the link below. Streaming via Spotify, Apple Music, all that good stuff. Let's just give it a quick listen.
I love your nature when it sound like that. And yeah, I miss it when it's gone, so bring that sound right back. And we can roll with it, we'll roll with it. I love your nature when it sound like that. And yeah, I miss it when it's gone, so bring that sound right back. And we can roll with it, just roll with it. Yeah, baby, we can roll with it, just roll with it. Let's fly.
I've just collapsed some of the folder groups over here just to save my computer because it's absolutely screaming right now. Let's get into the drums. If I remember rightly, it started with one break. It was actually quite a bad quality break, which I then later found out was a very poorly processed version of, I think it was the Sandy break, the Sandman break. So I switched that out and made everything just sound so much better. But anyway, let's just give the drums a real quick listen so you can get an idea of what they sound like on their own. So here are the drums. I'm going to try and break it down into sections as best as I can. So we're going to take a look at the break layers, the kick and snare layers, and then the top layers. We're going to break it down into those three sections. So I'm just going to start with the breaks here. There's only two breaks that I've actually used by the looks of it. D&B break 66, otherwise known as a Sandman break. Sorry, Josh, but it just sounded good for the track. And then I believe I chopped up a think break. And what I did was I actually split the break up, so I wasn't using it in its entirety. I just kept the parts that I felt worked well, and I've actually panned them. So I split them up and I've panned them. It sounds a little something like this. I just adds a nice scatty stereo panning ear candy kind of vibe to it. If we solo the Sandy break, you get a little something like this. Already sounds quite cool. Really nice as a little layer. So I'm just going to take a quick look at the processing on each of these elements. We're going to start off with the Sandman break. It doesn't look like there's a hell of a lot going on. We've got a compressor, which doesn't look like it's actually compressing. So I'm just using it for the soft clipping. I'm driving the input just a little bit. And then after that, we go into an EQ. It's probably just to tidy up the bottom. Yeah, there you go. Just to tidy off the bottom end, just to keep it clean. Rolled off some of the tops, because when you start soft clipping and saturating stuff, you end up with a lot of top end and a lot of fizz and a lot of noise. So sometimes when you do end up saturating or clipping stuff, you'll need to filter off or EQ some of that top end just to keep it tame. Otherwise it just ends up super bright and super harsh, and no one really wants to listen to that. So after the EQ, it looks like we've got a stereo widening tool, which I seem to be caning for some reason. And then after that, we're adding more stereo width with Ozone Imager. Bit of an interesting choice, but okay. So we're going to listen to it without the processing, and then we're going to play it with the processing. Quite a big difference. Obviously there's not as much bottom end in that, but also there's a lot of volume saved, probably because we've clipped it quite a lot. Right, let's take a look at the think break. Like I said before, I've split this up into individual channels. So one, you get more control, and two, you can do some pretty interesting stuff like panning, or if you wanted to send a hit out to a delay or something like that. You know, the world is your oyster. You can do whatever you want if you split things up. I would imagine all of the processing on this should be pretty much the same. All seems to be. You've already heard this section before, so I'm not going to play it again. But similarly with the Sandman break, it's all pretty simple, to be honest. Like, we got an EQ rolling off the bottom, some transient shaping just to pull the air, because if anyone's actually listened to the think break, I'm sure like 1,000,000,001 people have, there's a lot of roominess to it, and one of the easiest way to control that, instead of using a gate, is just to suck some of that sustain out with a transient shaper. You can use a gate as well, but you get a completely different sound. Like on the kick, I'm probably sucking out some of the room. I've dropped some of the attack as well, just so we don't get a lot of nasty transient build up. And it looks like I'm gating it as well, probably just to make that kick even tighter, because with the think break there's quite a big boomy room reverb thingy going on. So I've probably just done that to tame it. And because I've panned everything, I've made every part of the break mono, just to make sure it's not too sloppy on the sides, basically. So that's the break sections. As you can see, there actually isn't all that much going on there. Now we're going to have a look at the kicks and the snares. It looks like I forgot to mention the think break snare, which is down here with all the other snares. This one looks to be quite different to how I've processed the other elements of the think break. We've got an instance of decapitator here, which is probably just giving it some oomph with no low end roll off. That's interesting. Okay, let's just give it a quick listen. There's nothing going on this channel, so I'm just going to quickly delete that. Right, let's just move on to the bulk of the kicks. Let's give these two a listen, see what they sound like. I'm going to solo what is probably the top layer. We're going to solo that bottom. And together you get this. It's quite a hip-hoppy sounding kick, this one. Very acoustic, very pushed. Sounds really cool. Again, what we've got going on is super simple. So we've got, because this is a top layer, obviously you don't need all that low end weight. When you split a kick into separate layers, you don't want to be bunching up too much in the same region, otherwise it just ends up into a sloppy mess. So we've got an EQ just rolling off some of the bottom end. We've got another instance of decapitator, which looks like it's not doing too much, although yeah, just some subtle tone shaping. Fully wet, cool. And we're going into a compressor, which doesn't seem like it's doing all that much on the compression side, but again, we're soft clipping it. It's probably going to be quite a common theme actually throughout the video series, just how much I use Logic's stock compressor simply for the distortion section of the plugin. It's essentially just different clipping modes, which is super useful in getting loud tracks, getting everything sort of trimmed up. Then after the compressor, we've got a gain, a little bit of gain reduction, and mono. So for the lower end, what we've got going on is an EQ, which seems to be taking some of that super low muddiness out, which you don't really need because you've got sub bass down there. I'm going to assume there's a problem frequency here, which I've had to notch out. Yeah, okay, so that sounds a bit farty when it's not there. Next, another instance of decapitator. Seems quite similar to the top layer of the kick, although we're going for a not as dark tone with a little bit of low end roll off and quite a smidge of drive. So nothing too crazy, but enough just to give it a bit of bite. Let's just listen to it without. And we're going to listen to it with. It's a lot more rounded sounding with the decapitator. Probably that's mainly just due to the tone filter here. And the reason why I did that probably because there's a lot of layers going on, and when you're working with breaks, you don't want your main kick or the main body of your kick on its own to be too bright, because when you start layering stuff, you're just going to end up with a complete mess. So you need to be sort of, as you add things in, you need to take things away. It's just a constant balancing act, basically. All right, after that, we're going to move on to the snares. It looks like we've got another think break layer, which I've kept away from the shuffly scatty part, probably just for the sake of keeping the project tidy. I've just grouped that down here with the other elements. So we've got a think break snare, a clap, and 2 rim shots. Let's just give the think break snare a quick listen on its own. I love that sound. So loose, so scatty. Love it. Clap. Let's see what the clap's saying. A really nice distorted clap. A lot of top end on that. Gives it a lot of presence. Okay, first rim shot. That's definitely the body of the snare. Right, a lot of top end razzle dazzle. And then together, this is what it sounds like. As you can hear, there's quite a lot of frequency range coverage. So you've got your sort of like lower mids, upper mids, and even some highs thanks to the clap and the think break snare. So that's pretty cool. We're just going to go over the processing on this. Again, super simple, nothing outrageously crazy. We've got an EQ taking off some of the bottom, transient shaper because it's from the think break. We've pulled out some of that reverb using the sustain. Decapitator again. Probably why my computer can't handle this project is because I got decapitator on pretty much everything. About 60% mix. We've brightened it up a lot and we've pushed it not too hard, but we're pushing it. And then a compressor, probably just to tame the transient just a teeny tiny bit, and then we're clipping it again. This time we're not driving it because it's already driven by decapitator. The processing on the clap, EQ, again just rolling off the bottom. Just wanted that top mid-range sizzle so it cuts through. Not as aggressive compressor, soft clipping it. Again, I think at this point, if you see a compressor on the channel, it's probably just safe to assume that it's clipping something, not always compressing. Sometimes clipping and compressing, but you get the idea. And then we've got another EQ. Then we got Ozone's Imager 2 for a bit of stereo width. I'm actually curious to see how wide this is. All right, yeah, no, that's pretty wide, but it works in the mix, so that's okay. And then we're down to the rim shots. This one it's very pokey, and I was actually struggling with the transients quite a lot when it came down to the mix downs. And Josh, one half of Siran, he gave me a lot of advice. I've tried to tame the transients as best as I can, so the track isn't blowing anyone's eardrums out. But again, just down to the processing, super simple, cutting the lows, just clipping it. No compression. A noise gate, I'm guessing there was probably a little bit of fizz on the end of that. And then we got a transient master, which looks like it's boosting the transient just a tiny bit. And we've flipped it to mono. The second rim shot layer, this one looks like there's a tiny bit more going on. We've got quite an aggressive low end cut with a little notch out, probably to deal with a not so nice resonance or something like that. We've got a noise gate going on, probably not doing all that much, but just like the other one, I'm sure that it was there for a reason. Minor compression. Yeah, only about 3 dBs of gain reduction there, probably just to help control the transient a bit. Another instance of decapitator, this time we're going fully wet. So let's listen to what that sounds like without it. It's not as gnarly with decapitator. It's not as sharp and pokey. Looks like we're using another EQ just to smooth off that bottom end, get rid of some of that low end rumble that saturation can introduce, especially analog modeled saturation. Another instance of transient master, boosting the transient by quite a bit. 21% is quite a lot. I think this one was only boosted by 4%. So this one's definitely more pokey than the other one. Right, so far we've covered the breaks, kicks, and snare layers. Let's take a look and listen to the top loops. So the whole top section, which is used to add a lot of top-end interest, a lot of brightness, and just to fill out space. Let's just give this a listen on its own. You get the idea. Now, throughout the arrangement, I take some of these layers out. It's quite a neat little trick, actually. It's from a sonic density standpoint. When you remove something that was there before, your mind tells you that something's different, even if everything else is the same. Just take some of those top layers out just to keep interest so it doesn't always sound the same. So let's take a look at these layers individually. Then after that, once we've finished looking at these layers, we'll go into the group processing. It looks like we've got a little hat here with just some low-end roll-off with an EQ and a little bit of compression, and then we're clipping it again. So let's just give that layer a listen. So that's something I've made, just 2 different hats, just to give it a bit of a groove. So we got some rides here, 1 pan to the left, 1 pan to the right. I'm pretty sure it's the same sound that's just pitched slightly different. And honestly, that drum kit designer is such a useful tool. Yeah, so the processing on these, they both seem the same. Quite a lot cut out of the bottom. Got some soft clipping going on with a really heavy compression, although quite a lot of transient. So they're the 2 little ride sections. And then we're into the Lensman stuff. Honestly, Lensman's Loop Masters pack is so good for top loops. Nothing too in your face, but just a subtle layering. You can really fill out space. As far as processing goes, what we've got going on is an EQ. Looks like we're compensating for something here with a top shelf. We've sucked out all of the attack and we've boosted the sustain. So what that's done is just made it sound really washy. Let's just listen to it without the processing real quick. Can you hear how it's like really pokey and pretty dominant in the mix? Or it would be pretty dominant in the mix. Like that would be horrible in the top end. So just with the processing on, let's give that a listen now. So it's much nicer and it fills a lot more space because there's a lot of sustain and there's no pokey transients. So on the compressor, what we're doing, we're just making sure there's even less transients, and then we're clipping it again. It looks like we got a chorus going on too, just gives it a bit of stereo width. So without it, it sounds like this. And then with. It just pushes everything to the sides and it makes space for other elements in the mix to really come through. Like I said earlier, when it comes down to mixing, it's literally just a balancing act. So if you've got something that's super dominant in the middle, you don't want too much clutter to mask those sounds or frequencies. So that's why stereo separation is so important, especially when it comes to top loops. You don't necessarily want too much stuff from a top loop sitting in the middle because then it takes away from the impact of the kick and the snare or your break beats. All right, so another layer, another one from the Lensman pack. This one's got some gnarly looking EQs. I'm guessing there's probably some resonance in that. Then compressor, squashing it pretty hard this time. Again, clipping, absolutely 0 transients. Almost no transient on the transient master, so we've dealt with that. It sounds a little something like this. That's with the processing. And then without the processing. Quite a big difference. So yeah, on its own, that's just completely not usable. So I really had to work with that just to get it to do what I needed it to do. Massive difference. And then at the end, we've got that A1 stereo control plugin, which is just a stereo widener. We've got another Lensman loop. Yeah, so it sounds like it's the same thing. I've just processed it differently. I could have even pitched it down, possibly. Maybe not. But yeah, so the processing will probably be slightly different. Resonance control, we're clipping it this time with a FET compressor, which I absolutely love this in Logic. I've got boutique 1176 clones, emulations, whatever you want to call them, and I still always come back to this. Quite harsh with the compression, really fast attack, medium release. And we're clipping it again, I think. No, okay, so we're not driving the input on that. More transient control, sucking all of that spikiness out of it, and that magic width weapon, the Tau chorus, just to push it to the sides. Next, we've got another shaker by the looks of it. Let's give it a listen. Now that sounds quite dark, and that's coming from the Tau chorus. I can't remember. I think it's a Juno 6 chorus, something like that, which this is modeled on, and it's got some really cool filtering going on. So if I was to take that off, you should be able to listen to how bright it sounds without it. And then with. It's much darker and it fills out a completely different space compared to all these other loops. I'd probably just use that to fill out a lower registry frequency range, just to give it a bit more beef and a bit more coverage. Processing, EQ, nasty resonances, compression and clipping. It's pretty simple stuff. It just comes down to sound selection, I guess, and just throwing stuff together that works well. We've got another shaker. Sounds a bit like this. There's a bit more movement with that. We're using LFO tool to get that movement. It's on a ramp up on a 1 bar rate. Got that magic width weapon again. Compression, clipping, chopping out the lows and taming the highs. So I'm guessing would be, again, just to compensate for something else which is up there. You don't want it too busy, too noisy. And then the final shaker loop, which is this one. Which is the same as this one by the sounds of it. This one's dark, this one's bright. So yeah, so that would be the compensation then, wouldn't it? So that would be the difference. So that gives it a lot of thickness. Another way to do that would be to actually slightly detune them. Yeah, -4. That one's at the original pitch. That would explain why they sound different. Probably working on the same ramp. Oh, okay. So the one that isn't pitched is working on the opposing ramp to what the other one was. They're working against each other. That's quite a nice little trick I learned from Josh, one half of Siran. I may as well start giving him half of my flipping royalties at this point. I know I'm racking up on the beer tab, but I got to chisel that fucker down somehow. Let's just give these two a listen together and we can watch what the LFO ramp's doing. It kind of gives this really nice side chaining effect, as if they're bouncing off of each other, which is quite nice. It adds a lot of movement, stops everything being so static. As far as individual elements go, that's pretty much everything. During the intro, I've just used the break layers, but I've dropped them on their own channel and turned them down. That's all that's going on here. It's exactly the same as these break layers. I've just turned them down, so the drop has more impact, basically. That's the idea. Right, now onto the bus processing. If you notice, there is a couple of sends going on depending on which layer. The chances are from my workflow it probably won't be all that different. Bus 2 would be a drum group parallel compression, and then depending on the layer, we've got some other buses going on here. I don't think I used... Yeah. Okay, so I tried to separate the tops to give it some like higher end clarity, but chances are it's probably just too cluttered anyway. So that it muted, so we can ignore bus 5. Bus 4 would be the snare reverb. Actually, let's listen to the drums without the parallel, just with the bus processing, which we'll cover in a second. Let's see how much of a difference that simple little trick makes. And with. It's super subtle, but if you listen to the mid-range specifically, you can really hear the difference. It just fills it out a little more. I'll get over the channel strip for that in a second, but let's just get the drum group out of the way. And so everything here is being routed to the drum group. And to be honest, the Logic drum and bass template video that I made, that template was created from this track, actually. All of the drums are going into this drum group here. They're all getting sent to bus 1. And on that drum group, what we've got going on is an EQ to deal with some of those super lows. We've got another instance of Decapitator. I don't know how many times I need to say this, but Decapitator's drum fattener 1 is amazing. It just works. You just slap it on and boom, just drop the drive a bit, tone shape, and you're good to go. And then after that, we've got some multi-band compression, 4 bands, probably just taming those transients just a tiny bit to take the stress off of the limiter. Looks like we're oversampling at ×4. It's always good for low end. And then we're going into a limiter, which is pushing the gain up by 7 dB. We've got the output set down here to -4.8, and that gives us a constant level of 6.5 by the looks of it. I'm just going to press play with the limiter open just so you can see what's going on. We're not touching the peaks with the limiter, we're just bringing everything together. So if I was to switch that off, aside from the difference in volume, you should be able to hear how loose everything sounds, or everything should sound looser without that limiter. So let's just give it a listen to it with it switched off. And then switched on. It's really subtle, but it brings everything up. It just makes everything sound a little more glued And that's something that I like to do rather than always going for a compressor. The idea of using a limiter instead, it pulls everything together, and that's effectively the last point in your group processing chain. But you don't want to go too crazy with it, because if you push the gain too hard, you lose your dynamics. And at that point, once you've bounced the pre-master and you send that out to the label that's going to send it to mastering engineer, is not going to have too much to work with. So you really want to be careful with how much you are limiting things. You don't want to send the mastering engineer a file that's got headroom but absolutely zero dynamics. So you want to be very mindful of how much you're limiting your groups. Now, after the limiter, despite the limiter usually being the last point of the chain, it looks like there's some other things going on. So we've just adjusted the gain by -2 using Logic's gain utility. And then I would imagine this stuff here would be transitional effects. So we've got RSWT Records DJM filter, and then we've got Dada Life's Endless Smile. We have 2 instances of this, both on 2 different presets. I'm not sure if you picked up a common theme yet, but lazy man production tip: buy this and you don't have to piss around with making your own transitional effects, because you can just twist this knob, and that's exactly the face that you will make when you're working your beats with this plugin, because it's just such convenience. Alright, so that'll be the drum group processing. There's a bus here which is going out to bus 3, which is a room reverb. It sounds a little something like this on its own. Really nice and wide, nice and splashy, nice and bright. Valhalla Room, best reverb there is, in my opinion. It sounds really authentic. It sounds really organic. It doesn't sound synthetic at all, which is exactly what I like. I don't like too many synthetic sounds. We've got 0 pre-delay, 1.55 second decay, so it's not too long. We're cutting the highs out because we don't want too much clutter up there in, you know, like the 10k plus region. And we've got quite a dense space, which keeps everything sounding tight. It shrinks the reflection waves, so they're not too splashy and overbearing. It just sounds nice and tight, almost like a slapback. But because we have a longer decay, it's not as slapbacky. So yeah, that'll be the room reverb. There's just an EQ to cut out some of that lower mud, which you just really don't want, especially with a reverb. Then we got this A1 stereo control, which apparently I really like to use back then anyway. That's being pushed to its absolute limit, so that reverb's sitting on the sides quite nicely. Right after the room reverb, we've got a snare reverb, which looks like we're using Logic's stock Chromaverb. It sounds a little something like this. And apparently I'm not just routing snares to this bus. It sounds like we're putting that shuffle through it too, which is pretty cool. It sounds nice and splashy, gives it a lot of space. And you know what? For a stock reverb, this is really nice. It's not the most organic sounding reverb. It is quite 80s kind of synth wave, synth pop sounding, but just for a little bit of space and a little bit of splash, it's really good. After the reverb, we're cutting out some of the lows just to deal with the mud. We're pushing it to the sides, interestingly enough, with Infected Mushrooms wider. Now this is a really cool stereo tool. It's free, so if you don't have it, you should get it. And it looks like we're doing a bit of gain reduction with Logic's utility. And that's pretty much it for the drums. There's some slight variations going on throughout, which I don't really feel like I would need to cover in the video, but I'm just going to scroll through the entire track just so you get a rough idea. Here's an example of that lazy man's production technique. You don't always need to add things to the source. You can always try and take things out, see if that works for you. It's like we've got a nice little switch at the end of every 4 bars or so. Scrolling through, I know there are some rides that come in which are a lot more organic and natural sounding during the intro, I think, which I'm just going to go over, which are over here. Yeah, so we've got some intro hats here which sound quite nice. A really nice and live sounding ride just to add to the ambience of that section. Aside from the layers, there isn't really much going on. There's not much to talk about other than the parallel group, which is, like, if you really want to get into what I'm doing here, it's a technique called New York compression, or New York style compression. I can't remember the actual name for it, but essentially what you're doing is you're parallel smashing a collection of sounds, and in this case I'm doing it on drums. It adds a lot of body. It can add a lot more space, I guess. So you can almost introduce a tail to something that would otherwise be quite tight, but the idea behind it is to make something sound livelier, and it just works really well. So for that, what I've got here is we're starting with an EQ to take out a lot of the body and the weight from the kick, because we don't want that to be triggering the compressor too much. And then we're going into the SSL G console compressor from Waves, smashing it quite hard by the looks of it. We've got a ratio of 10, threshold of negative 5.4. Let's just give that a quick listen actually. Let's just listen to that on its own. It's quite pokey actually. Usually with New York style compression you would have a really fast attack and sort of like a longer release or even a shorter release just to give it some real snap. Not so much snap but more of a washy sound. In this case it looks like I've gone for more of a poke rather than a washy kind of effect essentially. But there's quite a lot of washiness from the top layers, so that would make sense. You can't have both. After the compressor we've got an expander, which is quite similar to RSWT Records OTT, which I feel like kind of gets overviewed a lot. It's an upwards compressor, basically, which is what OTT is. And it looks like I'm just using the More Punch preset. I probably tweaked it a bit, but yep, that's going on there. And then we got an enveloper. So we've boosted some of the attack and we've sucked out some of the air. So it seems like all I wanted to do was reinforce some of the transients that may have been lost from the main drum group. And then we've reintroduced it to the main track, but really subtly by the looks of it at negative 44 decibels, which I'm going to assume is, yeah, so we got minus 20 gain reduction happening with the utility. But back to the arrangement, it's really simple. We've got some small micro edits. We'll take a look at the automation in just a second. We've got some small micro edits throughout. Again, another lazy man trick. We've got those intro hats coming back in during the second half of the breakdown. We've got some shakers. Then yeah, we've got quite a nice big section here of empty space. Makes everything a little more dramatic and dynamic. Then yeah, I thin the drums out for the last 16. So we're going to finish with the automation, which is something that I absolutely hate having to deal with. It's probably because my computer's getting really old now and it can't handle it, but it's a ball ache regardless. So let's just have a quick look at the automation. So this lane of automation is controlling the cutoff of the DJM filter over here, just to give some transitional dynamics at the end of phrases, at the end of every 16 bars or whatever. We're pushing the drive up. Is there any resonance going on? Yeah, just some tiny little resonance peaks too, to give it that kind of, if you're watching this video and you're a DJ, when you use the filter on a DJM mixer, chances are there's a resonant peak. Some mixers have a parameter control to effectively boost that resonance or take it away completely, and that's what I'm simulating here during some of the transitions. And then the endless smile, just doing some minor little reverb flourishes, which is really nice and adds a lot of depth and dynamics and character to it. So that will be the end of part one. Hopefully it wasn't too rambly, and hopefully it was focused, and hopefully you gained something from it. Aside from all the amounts of layering, it really isn't too much to it at all. Just sound selection, step one. Minor processing, making everything fit together, and then putting everything into a space with some reverb. That's the workflow that I have with drums. Really vague, but that's pretty much it. You've seen everything. So yeah, that'll be the end of part one. Part two, we'll probably be talking about some of the musical elements and maybe even the effects. So subscribe if you want to see that one. If you want to support me, Patreon is available to you. There's plenty of sample packs on there. Hopefully in the future we can get some production live streams going, maybe even some remix competitions. I've got some track stems up there. Or if you'd like to support me one time, I'm a big coffee lover, and there's a lovely little service called buymeacoffee.com, which is in the description of this video if you fancy buying me a coffee. If you feel like this video has added any kind of value to your life or to your production or anything at all, or maybe you just want to be nice, maybe you just want to get me a double espresso because I love those things. But yeah, that's the end of part one. I hope that was informative. I hope to see you again in part two and beyond. Cheers.